Thank you so much, Vitor, my friend, my colleague, my partner in these colonial collections issues in Portugal. I'm no longer chair of the IUHCT, the International Committee of ICOM for University Museums and Collections. That's the only correction I want to do. I'm very grateful to Elizabeth Pereira for the invitation, and I really wished I was there with you. I have so many people, friends that I would like to be with and that I would like to meet too, but unfortunately I couldn't at the last minute. So, and also at the museum, which I love, the Santos Rocha Museum with a new exhibition, which I definitely will see in coming days. So I also would like to congratulate Elizabeth for the Transmat project, which I think is the most important research project of the past years addressing the material legacy of Portuguese colonialism. It will be a reference, particularly in terms of provenance research. Most importantly, the project proved that decolonization of museums in Portugal is possible and there is nothing to fear. Today, I will talk about some of our reparation and resignification work of colonial collections at the National Museum of Natural History and Science at the University of Lisbon. These last years at MUHNAC, as we call our museum for short, have been a crazy, super fast roller coaster. And I have a lot to share with you, much more than I will have time to do today. I decided to focus on our path to engage with communities of origin. It has been difficult, especially at the beginning, like every new thing. I will explore with you some examples. But before we enter the topic, let me very briefly describe our museum and our colonial collections. So, the National Museum of Natural History and Science has its origins in the 18th century. It includes a botanic garden since the 19th century, and it's part of the University of Lisbon since 1911. Like so many university collections in Europe, and not only in Europe, our collections were associated in one way or another with teaching and research. In 2015, the University of Lisbon received from the government the collections and archives from approximately 120 scientific missions to former Portuguese colonies in Africa and Asia. These collections include around 3 million objects: cartography, archaeology, zoology, bioanthropology, ethnography, botany, photography and films, geology and mineralogy, never been dispersed, highly coherent, thoroughly documented, with 5 linear kilometers of archives. Plus, the university also received one botanic garden, the former colonial botanic garden, which is now called Tropical Botanic Garden in Belém, Lisbon. Everything entered the university in 2015. Needless to say that this transfer, exactly 10 years ago, changed the museum forever. The disruption impacted public and storage spaces, conservation, public programs, databases, public access, absolutely everything. I have some examples of the collections, just a few. There's photography collections, there are soil collections on your right screen. There's the bioanthropology collections, and also some samples of applied economic botany and not only botany, but mostly collections. Also the Tropical Botanic Garden, which has an incredible history of suffering and violence and extractivism. It's all there. And there's some remains, not only the plants, obviously, but there are some structures and objects that result also from a very important exhibition that was done in 1914, and part of this exhibition was done in the Tropical Botanic Garden. So I'm going to show you some elements that we still have to address. It's one of our priorities in terms of reinterpretation, resignification. There is an island in the Botanic Garden where there was a human zoo in 1914 with people living there for 6 months from Guinea, what is today Guinea-Bissau. And there are also 14 busts representing types of people from the former Portuguese colonies. When the museum received the collections, decolonization of museums was already a thing. We museums know it's not exactly true that everything started in 2020 with Black Lives Matter. It did indeed accelerate, and it entered the public sphere, but it did not begin in 2020. Important discussions happened before, including the famous 2018 General Assembly of ICOM in Kyoto, Japan, where the proposed museum definition, the initial one, was rejected. In my view, we go even back to community and neighborhood museums in the Americas in the 1950s and 1960s, and also to the 1972 Declaration of Santiago. In a way, I see the current movement of European museums as the social function of museums finally arriving in Europe. It's social function of museums 2.0. So the museum knew, we knew what was coming with these collections, and we tried to prepare as best as we could. We developed very briefly 7 axes, which I will not have time to develop here. So establishing our values, doing provenance research and identification of extremely sensitive objects, providing full and universal access with focus on the communities of origin. These collections were not, these 3 million objects were not in a museum, and so that changed things. Even if there was no problem, no sensitive objects, that would change things anyway. Recovery of hidden information, stories through the diversification of sources and voices. Restitution, particularly the Nagoya Protocol, and sharing. Critical approach towards the role of the museum, and work on and about the present. So the first thing we did was the identification of sensitive objects. This will be published in a paper coming out by Ana Godinho, Catarina Mateus, and Catarina Simões. These are the criteria we used: objects with no or minimal documentation, human biological materials, sensitive human representations of violence, sexism, racism, abuse, sacred objects, looted objects, collecting after UNESCO conventions and after CITES, sensitive collecting agents, sensitive collecting dates, and scientific relevance vis-à-vis the history of science context. I do not have time to go through the program, but I recommend you that you go to our YouTube. That's where we've been putting all the materials, more than actually on the website. It was clear from the start that the museum wanted to engage with the communities, not because we needed them for metadata resignification, or we needed to say that we were working with them, a kind of tokenism, but because only with their access, participation, and representation did the process seem right, seem complete. seem just. Without them, the balance could never even begin to be reestablished. We wanted to work with the communities, but what are the communities and where are they? That was our first question. Contrary to other museums in Portugal and elsewhere, our museum had no tradition of collaborative work with specific target groups, except school groups, obviously. So we came up with a working definition, which was Portuguese citizens of Afro-descendants, the diasporas of countries of origin, and citizens presently living in the countries of origin. So this latter we put aside and left for a later stage, but we can never forget them. We cannot forget them. We consolidated contacts with museum professionals in Angola and Mozambique, mostly. We had the first meeting with museum professionals from Angola, September last year, because museums are our main interlocutors to citizens in the countries of origin, because ultimately, had there been no colonialism, the collections that we have now would be in these museums, right? So the first years were not good. We got contacts, we had meetings. We were talking and listening, but we didn't seem to be progressing. Sure, there was COVID, so that was a factor too, but substantively, we didn't seem to be advancing, to be doing things together. At some point, we realized that we were not talking to communities, we were talking to representatives of communities, and I think that made all the difference. It's different. Of course, representatives of communities like associations and so on, they do have legitimate agendas, but they're not necessarily the museum agenda. Okay, so fortunately, we had a facilitator. An exhibition was a facilitator. This exhibition was a major step in our museum, in many, many, many dimensions that I cannot even begin to address here. Also internally, all the reflection we had to do internally. It's called Photographic Impulse, and it's the first exhibition that really problematizes the issue of colonial collections, that really addresses the problem. And it was done by 17 curators and only one curator who was from the museum, Catarina Mateus, who was the curator of the photography collection, because the exhibition was about, or departed, had point of departure, the photography collection. Those 70 curators were academics, activists, artists, writers, students, and this exhibition gave us two very important things. The first was the methodology, which was basically, from the point of view of the museum, to relinquish power and authority, to step back. We learned about the immense power of giving away power. And the exhibition also gave us, second thing, meaningful, direct and unmediated contact with communities. So after that, the progress, this is some of the activities that were done in the exhibitions. After that, the progress came naturally, gradually, but especially naturally. We started going out there and meet people where they live. We began to go to their commemorations, their festivals, eat in their cafes and restaurants, attend their demonstrations, cultural events and concerts. We built a relationship based on the trust of keep coming back. And ideas gradually started to come up, like they always do when people get together, in music, in dance, in theater, all addressing issues of collective and individual memories, history, heritage, and belonging. Today, we have 17 small-scale, low-cost, community-driven projects in different stages of development. Some are just ideas. And our main activities develop in these red dots that I show you. So there's the museum, which is there where Lisbon is. There's the Tropical Botanic Garden, which is part of the museum. It's still in Lisbon. And then there are two populations, neighborhoods, underserved, which is Segundo Torrão in Trafaria and Val da Amoreira. So these projects, they involve activities where people live and also activities in the museum. I brought 3 examples that will allow me to have some incipient reflections at the end. So the first example is the visits that are being done currently by a collective, a Tributo aos Ancestrais. So the Tributo aos Ancestrais are a group that I met in Lagos last year, in Algarve, in the south of Portugal. And they do tribute of mostly of people who died and who were enslaved during the transatlantic Atlantic slave trade. And so I met them, and they do very moving homage. And I put here the date where they're going to do this year in Lisbon, and that's 6 July, so you can note in your agendas. I know the Museum of Lisbon is also involved, so it's a special moment for us to, as museums, as cultural sector, to be involved. So I met them, and I don't know, in December, around December, they proposed they started visiting our collections, and in December they said, we want to do tours of the collections. And we were absolutely, the collections are the ethnographic collections and also the wood collection. We were absolutely delighted because this is precisely what we wanted to do, but we didn't at the same time necessarily want to ask. So they came to us and said, no, you just leave us alone, which is exactly what's happening. We just leave us alone and we do these registrations, we select the objects, we interpret the objects, we do the tours. And so that has been happening more or less twice every month. The next will be 22 March. And the collections are here in the Tropical Botanic Garden. And here are some images of their activities there. We just opened the door, basically. The second example is with a group of children, and this is a more complex, long-term project, but I will just highlight some points. So it started when that beautiful, beautiful porcupine that you see on the left in a box was taken to a school of 10, 11 years old kids from an underserved community in Val da Amoreira, that's Moita. And it was an incredible experience to take that animal, a taxidermized animal there. A lot of engagement of the school, the students, of the families, of the teachers, of the whole school community. And recently, two weeks ago, the kids came to the collections, also ethnographic collections. They looked at the musical instruments. We want them to be involved in an exhibition we're going to do, maybe later this year. They selected their musical instruments, and then they developed a workshop where they built their own musical instruments. I didn't prepare any video because I thought, it always goes wrong with Zoom, the videos, but we have amazing videos of these kids playing their instruments. The next step will be our collection. So the musical instruments from the collection will go to the schools, and we have conversations with families about the memories that result from these musical instruments. Segundo Torrão is the most, I would say, probably the the one that will engage the museum in a more profound way, because it's a long keep going on with things, with activities, and we really want the community to to show us more about what they need. And so we did some things. For example, we did a fabulous pedagogical activity, archaeology, with kids. There are some areas in this neighborhood where the houses have been demolished and people rehoused. And so we excavated the site of the demolitions. This is something that was incredibly moving, because the children were excavating, in some cases, their own houses. And then we brought the objects that were collected by the children, and we had an exhibition at the museum. The exhibition was called Archaeologies of Destruction. And the kids came to the museum, and we had conversations about those objects, and it was a really interesting, more than interesting. It was the first time that these kids, I love this photo, the one on the left. It was the first time that some of these kids entered the museum, number one. Number two, that they even crossed the bridge to Lisbon. So it was deeply moving. We're trying to do more things in the area of community archaeology. We'll see where it leads us. To finish up, some reflections. So, as a principle, the museum, we don't have abstract conceptual views about the decolonization of museums. Like, stuff that sometimes journalists ask. What do you think about repatriation? What do you think about human remains, or where they should stay, where they shouldn't stay? We do not address that in that conceptual, abstract way. We just do concrete, small, community-driven actions. Very importantly, I think decolonization is not about the past, it's about the present. And it's not about us, it's not about collections or the museum, it's first and foremost about the people. It should be centered on the people. I'm not saying anything new, okay? So many museums and, the network we have, our connections with UK museums, Dutch museums, French museums, Brazilian museums, really it's not something unusual. The decolonization movement, so to speak, started being about collections, and then it began being about people. Specifically regarding communities, it takes long to build relationships and trust. We know this. And the museum needs to go out and be willing to listen. This is incredibly important. We cannot just wait and expect the communities to come to us only. Also, communities is a dangerous word, because communities are not monoliths. They're composed of people, individuals, and also stratified, as we realized at the beginning with the representatives. And there's also an elite of the communities. There's the underserved part of the communities. And so all that needs to be taken into account when engaging, when participating, when collaborating. Two major risks, I think, for a museum like ours with no previous experience is the romanticification and the white savior complex, which is that, idea that we get there and we know how to do this. You need to get organized and do an association, and then you can be partnering projects. You need to do this, you need to do that. That's something that we need to control ourselves not to do, and understand why it shouldn't be done. Finally, the instrumentalization of communities. Right, so communities and these people who live in these neighborhoods, but not only, they are tired of being observed, researched, and manipulated by the academy, NGOs, politicians, cultural agents who arrived, do their thing, and then leave. I think the museums in general, need to think very well about their motives and level of engagement that should drive community action, so that some institutional catharsis does not subsume the real needs and interests of the community. In other words, the museum needs to be prepared to address larger issues such as the structural underpinnings and historical legacies that together sustain problems like living conditions, ghettification, unemployment, discrimination, inequality, and so many others. If the museum is not prepared to be political, community-driven activities will be certainly well-intended, but nothing more than self-aggrandizing emotional experiences that ultimately instrumentalize the community. In a way, the more political is the museum, the less instrumentalized and more respected is the community. Sure, everything is political, but this is a big step for many museums, including ours. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Marta Lourenço. In fact, thank you one more time for sharing a lot of important and crucial topics. I really appreciate the fact that decolonization is not about the past, it's about present, and is about practices of change, the structure of relation, our relation or our relations with the peoples and with the world. I have some notes, and I think we have time to some questions and answers.
My name is Ralph Killius, independent researcher from London. Thank you so much, Marta. I really enjoyed your presentation, and especially I like your community projects, which is that's what we need, I think. Just one question. You were very successful in connecting your activities with the diasporic communities around Lisbon and other places. Did you try to reach out to connect to the source communities from some of your objects came from, or was it just not possible?
My name's Fiona Batt. I have a particular interest in the restitution of human remains, and this is quite a direct question. I'm just a bit confused that as such a renowned director of a museum, you don't have a policy on restitutions, particularly human remains, because I believe there are human remains maybe in your museum. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Miriam Kurun. I'm head of the Museums Lab program. I'm based at the Natural History Museum in Berlin. And as you're probably aware, we've also been working on the criteria and also what can be publicly published on catalogs, etc. So I'm wondering, looking at the criteria for identification of extremely sensitive objects, how do you handle this in the current discussions around digitization and also making catalogs more accessible? Do you take some of the parts which are mentioned or labeled here in your presentation out of these catalogs, or how do you mention them when you speak about these categories in your museum? Thank you.
Marta, good morning. I'm Elizabeth Pereira. Hello. I wanted to ask you, how do you feel about the situation in Portugal concerning collections when we know the national program of digitizing our collections in museum and prioritizing this digitization when the collections are not well documented, and we, as ECOM report showed, we don't know what we have in museums, and museums don't know the collections they have, and they don't have detailed information on it. Why prioritize digitization when there is another basic work to do before that, I think, in my opinion?
I'll start by replying to Elizabeth, which is also related to the other question about digitization. Yeah, okay, so yeah, digitization, very important, but I think that in Portugal we still have a lot of work to do, and I would put this question under the circumstances of access, okay, because what we need is access, to give universal access to, particularly to the communities of origin. And sure, digitization important, there is a lot of money apparently to the ministry to the museums of the culture sector to digitization, but how are you going to, you need to address the problematic of colonial collections, and that means that addressing that every object is sensitive of colonial provenance, and some of them are especially sensitive. We use the criteria of the German Association of Museums, by the way, but we added 2 or 3 criteria more related to the Portuguese context. And I think in our museum, we plan to put the collections online this year. And from that evaluation that was finished, we didn't have provenance research issues. Documentation was really coherent, but we did have human remains, and even worse than human remains, if I may say. And some of the collections, you saw that there were 8 groups of objects that resulted from this evaluation, and these 8 groups of objects will be the subject of, each one will have its own program of interpretation, reparation, eventually repatriation. As a museum director, I don't have the power to decide about repatriation of human remains or whatever objects. I cannot do that. But I have my opinion, obviously, and certainly human remains should not be in our museum. We have human remains, not only bodies of people, so 3 skeletons of people, but also 16,000 blood samples in cards, and also hairs, lots of hairs. This was natural in bioanthropology kind of research. And so, yeah, I have an opinion, and all that should be sent back, at least the skeletons, because the blood samples, well, I don't have time to address it, because blood samples, it's more difficult to evaluate origin and so on, so it's problematic. But yeah, sure, human remains should go back, definitely. But Portugal needs a national policy for that. There's not even legislation about that, which brings me back to the national plan. I think that there should be an alliance of all the museums in Portugal that have colonial collections, and there are many, but not only museums, also secondary schools, universities, and we should have some strategic plan to work together, grassroots, and eventually shape policy, sure, and legislation too. And the first thing that I think that this alliance of museums with colonial collections in Portugal should do is precisely to listen to the communities. It's imperative. We need to establish a link with the communities, the diasporas, the communities of Afro-descendants, and the museums in the countries of origin, so that we can start working together, because it's not the museum to itself, right? And then we should probably look at other countries in Europe, what they're doing, because they are more advanced, definitely, some. And finally, we should go through our collections and identify these extremely sensitive objects that we have, that result from violence, from suffering. We can do that. And I think there's nothing to be afraid of, as long as it's open, transparent, and with the communities. I think I replied to everything, in a way.
So thank you, Marta, for your answers. And I would like to ask Rudo Sitole, who raised hand. Please open your microphone and make your question, please.
For the opportunity. Thank you, Marta, for seeing my hand. And thank you so much for that beautiful presentation. And we also saw those very beautiful objects. So I have two questions for you. Okay, maybe to start with, I think you are doing a wonderful job to involve the communities who are associated with the objects. And I think it's a very good starting point, even though you say that you don't have the power for the repatriation, and at the moment you are not thinking about repatriation. I wish you could think more about repatriation and, returning the heritage to the source community. So my first question was, where do these objects originate from? Because I think currently you are dealing with the diasporic community already in Portugal, but maybe there's also need to involve the people from the source communities, maybe who are still in the communities or countries of origin. Then my second question is about, you said that colonization is not about the past, but it's about the present. If you can please expound on that a little bit more, because I strongly believe that decolonization is actually more about the past than the present, because we are trying to address, for example, the colonial injustices, the enslavement injustices. Yes, of course, we have the current communities like the ones you were talking about, but I'll talk more about this in my presentation. Recently, we did some research in Zimbabwe and Namibia, where we were interviewing descendants, and these are like 4th, 5th generation. But can you imagine, they are still crying today about their ancestor who was killed more than a century ago. So I think for me, decolonization is both about addressing what happened in the past and how it's affecting present generations. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your question, Rudo Sitoli. And maybe I can add one or two more questions in the second round. And before
This is a difficult one. I need time for this one. These are two very good questions. I need time for this, Vitor.
Okay. So I give you time to this, and then I will add in the next round to 2 or 3 questions, okay? Go ahead.
Okay. Udo, it's very important questions you raise. And I'm not saying I don't think about repatriation. I do, in fact, all the time. And it's just that if sometimes museums, I think that sometimes thinking about repatriation, which is at the end of the line, and it's so much instrumentalized by media, can be paralyzing for a museum. You understand what I say? You can sort of think, okay, let me just organize myself and my plan of action in view of repatriation. And that's not necessarily, I'm not saying it shouldn't be in our minds all the time, but it's not necessarily productive in the immediate term. And there's so much to do in Portuguese museums in the immediate term. So these things of provenance research, identification of very, very difficult and problematic objects, sensitive objects, it takes a lot of time. It takes historians in museums. It takes money. It takes funding. And museums are doing it with whatever they can, you know. And so we need to catch up in a way in order to reach the point where we know what we have, as Elizabeth said, and we're prepared to address issues, complicated issues like policy, repatriation, even access, okay? So that's one thing. Okay, so this is the present and the past. Probably it's my personal default. I work in museums for 25 years, and I always thought that museums are more about the present than about the past. In other words, that every generation should provide these encounters of objects of the past with people of the present. So this was my mindset even before I began thinking about any of these issues. So what I mean specifically is that you have to look at the present, and the present not only in Europe, of course. You have to look at the present and how the present is impacted by the legacy of colonialism in the past. And sure, you have to look at the past. You have the material evidence of the past in your museum, but you have to be able to bring it up and transform people of all walks of life through encounters with those objects and through the stories that those objects can activate, instantiate, inspire. So that's what I mean. Of course, it's about the past, but we need to think about the present in order to transform societies. So it's more about that. I think we're saying the same thing, but you're good, and I'm grateful for your asking to clarify.
Thank you, Marta. So, okay, another round of question. I can have two questions first.
Thank you. Thank you, Marta. My name is Anahita Amaral. I'm a researcher in a project in the Netherlands called Pressing Matter. Maybe you've heard of it. I research particularly the role of religion and in these debates about colonial heritage, and I've been researching collections gathered by missionaries for a long time, and you sparked my curiosity when you talked about the criteria, and you had one that was sacred objects. Could you tell us a bit more about how you're dealing with those particular objects and what kind of mission were they associated with? What kind of documentation they have? Thank you.
Thank you, Anna.
There's going to be a paper. There's going to be a paper about that. Okay, so it's about to come out about all the, the results from the audit, internal audit we did based on those criteria. We're still looking. We're still examining what we do. We think we have 3 sacred statues. We're not sure. But we're gathering the state of the art, so typically, and I'm going to be very, very, very superficial about this. I don't want to, but I'll be very superficial. Usually, most museums provide a space in the museum for rituals. They're on the list for repatriation. In my mind, that could be probably the best solution, but I'm not sure about that yet. And also, they can be deconfigurated, some of them. So there are options that you can evaluate. We don't have, I think, missionary collections in Portugal, but in the Netherlands there's a lot, in Germany there's a lot, and so there's that. But they're not necessarily sacred, you know, they're ethnographic collections, like what we call ethnographic collections, like so many museums. They're not necessarily, the religion dimension comes from another angle, I think, but thank you.
Hello, my name is Carlos Batista. I work in Santo Rocha Museum and I am part of Transmat and a PhD student of History of Science. And I would like to know, Professor, how does the museum will address the challenge of exhibiting colonial era photographs that depict violence and oppression? How in the world of access to this information will be these photographs? How do you see this kind of, for me it's like human remains, so how the museum is working with photographs and imagery of violence and oppression? Thank you.
We have a group of 35 photographs taken in the late 1940s, early 1950s, that 2 or 3 days after I became director, I realized and acknowledged their meaning in terms of history of science, in terms of representation, and those collections actually, those photographs actually, everyone knows who knows me, changed me deeply. The fact that we have those 35 photographs, we know exactly where they were taken, we know what is depicted there, we know it's illegitimate, the kind of research question that was being made at the time. We're still researching, but I remove them from exhibition, which does not mean that the truth of those 35 photographs should not be said and told. And I think the arts, that's when I thought that the arts, theater, namely literature, I immediately thought of an Angolan woman, female writer, for example, to describe those photos one by one, and then, yes, the description, we could post them on the exhibition rooms. But there are other options that we're going to do, but definitely we're not going to display images of degradation of women, especially, these are photographs of women, but could be of any human. Because what I think is incredible is how the people who took those photographs were looking at fellow humans and could not see the human inside. This is for me the most shocking. And the minute we make it public, we're degrading these women once more, where it's undignified. And this even causes a problem for repatriation. I could talk about these 35 photographs for hours, because these people could be alive, some of them, and are going to repatriate what? To the descendant? To the daughters? The granddaughters? What are you going to do with them? These images that depict extreme violence, suffering, indignity, subhumanization. What are you going to do with them? I don't have an answer for this. But the truth must be told.
My name is Jos van Beurden from the Netherlands, and thank you very much for your contribution. You know, when I read the title of your presentation, Power to Communities, I was very happy. And now in the discussion, it feels that, you know, if it is about the space of repatriation, it's power to the museum. Could you reflect on that? That's one question.
Sorry, I did. Could you speak? I didn't understand the last part of the question. Could you repeat it?
Well, you were talking about repatriation and how difficult it is for a museum. So if you're talking about repatriation, you're giving power to the museum instead of to the community.
You're right.
Yeah.
I know.
So how big is this power of the community? And what also strikes me is that if you're talking about communities, it's rather amorph. It's communities.
I know.
What about community leaders? What about asking community leaders to give feedback to the museum at an equal level instead of the museum doing things for the communities? Could you reflect on that?
Yeah, sure. Well, my point was all about that. About not talking to community leaders only, but especially to emerge with the community, to participate in their activities without expecting anything. And eventually, gradually, projects will come up, joint projects that interest both, right? So I think I was not clear, but that was all about it. I stress that it's not about the museum. The work with the communities, obviously. Repatriation is a different thing, because repatriation, I think there should be, first, you know, all that work that needs to be done with the communities of identification of extremely sensitive objects, and interpretation, resignification, all that. But then when it comes to repatriation, yeah, we need to do better in Portugal. We need to have, we need to know our collections better, and we need to have a national policy. It's a little bit similar to the situation of France. And I think Belgium also had a Parliament Act in order to allow objects to go back to the... So there's this statute of museums that does not enable them,
well, I know that
or does not enable directors to decide what to do based on claims from community, source communities or
most of the restitution.
I was clear.
Yeah, most of the restitution law in Belgium was written by the director of the National Museum of the Africa Museum in Tervuren.
Yeah.
So my suggestion would be that the museums start writing a policy and try to come to a conclusion. But there's one other thing about communities. The answer about what to do with these horrible pictures you're describing, you can get it from the communities if you give them real power.
I know. We've done that.
Yeah, thank you.
We're working with a theater group with Angolan women. And okay, so I didn't develop what we're doing, but yes, that's vital. That's vital.
Thank you. Last question, please.
Thank you. I'm Joana Passos. I'm from University of Minho. I'm a literary critic. Hello. So again, I am the fish out of the water in the group. And I felt I should interfere now because what you did, Marta, was very interesting. The moment you're talking about extremely sensitive objects and degradation and difficulty in handling very emotional material, that's when you started talking about writers and theater. And I think that is maybe what I think sometimes it's missing here, is the fact that when science has a limit to deal with certain painful material, that's when art comes in. Because there is a cathartic effect. Sometimes art can deal with very difficult subjects in an indirect way. Of course, that does not remove all the other important work you are doing here. But I think in terms of transdisciplinarity, to include the aesthetic and the artistic contribution, also to find ways to communicate with people, also either in diaspora or in the original community. It's very important. And for example,
I agree, Joana, entirely.
And I think here in Portugal, before museums started telling the general public that decolonization had to be thought through and that it was important to reconsider our history, it was the writers from African countries that start doing that to people.
That's right.
That's what I want to say. Thank you.
That's right. You're right. I agree. I entirely agree. It was also new for us. Well, not so much, but because we have a permanent program at the museum since the 1980s of art and science, but not focused on these issues that we're discussing here. And that takes a different methodology approach, different artists that are willing to be political activists and so on. And sometimes that doesn't happen also in the culture sector. So it took also a while, but yeah, we have an European funded project that it's all about artistic residencies. We just had 2 women artists staying with us in February. We will have more next year. It involves 18 partners. And so, yeah, we're opening that front really quick, precisely for the motives you said, but others too. Thank you, Joana.